Well, thank you. Delighted to be here. Of all the introductions I've ever received, that is the most recent. And now, all over the world, democracy is in disarray. Approval ratings for key leaders and institutions are vanishingly low. The public distrusts the policy elites, and the elites fear the angry voices of populism. The very idea of democracy is under threat from supposedly benevolent forms of authoritarianism, like the Singapore model, or what is held to be the China model, and also by the stealth transformation of democracy via what's called competitive authoritarianism, by which democratic forms are turned into non-democratic processes. Democracy appears to deliver deadlock, and these other systems appear to deliver efficient results. Is the solution more democracy or less democracy? Depends what you mean by what kind of democracy. I want to disaggregate this a little bit and say that the solution, or at least I have or will claim to have, a constructive remedy. It's not a complete solution, but it's something useful that should be done. But to see how distinctive it is, you have to see the limitation of the forms of democracy that we have. I boiled down all the varieties of democratic practice into basically 4 kinds of democracy. The most important being competitive democracy, party competition democracy, which has spread around the world. Remember, the most influential theorist of competitive democracy, Joseph Schumpeter, said that with a competitive democracy, we cannot expect a genuine public will. We can expect only a synthetic kind of public will because parties want to win, and they use the same methods that firms use to create preferences of the people via advertising and other such methods. So they create the public will. The will of the people is a kind of mythology for the classical theory of democracy, which he rejected. We can't really expect the will of the people to be meaningful in competitive democracy. And if you're unconvinced, I think one of the strongest examples is you just read Kathleen Jameson's book, Dirty Politics, and you'll see how that includes the Willie Horton Dukakis case, and you'll see how the manipulation of public opinion is a central part of the way parties win. Parties do not want to win the argument, they want to win the election. And so we need to think the real problem with democracy is hiding in plain sight. Every time an election is won, a mandate is claimed, the people have spoken, we are told, but we need to think about, a fancy term for it, the conditions for public will formation. We need to think about who is actually deliberating and thinking in the way that Teresa described, who is considering the reasons on either side on the basis of some account of good information. Well, our own system was born in a vision, as Jack pointed out, famously pointed out, and as even you can find in, all you need to do is read Federalist 10, as he invoked, that representatives we're supposed to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. They were supposed to deliberate on the merits. But at that point, Madison did not envision political parties. Political parties enforce party discipline. They have whips to make sure that the people vote the party line. And representatives have little room for deliberation. And elite deliberation really, there may be commissions, maybe the Federal Reserve, in certain, it would be complicated to talk about the courts, but our elected representatives and office holders have little incentive to deliberate. Then there's participatory democracy. I live in California. we have ballot measures all the time. And the basis for reasoning about those ballot measures is no more evident than it is in competitive elections between political parties. And indeed, the obfuscation, the multiplication of ballot measures that seem to be about the same thing, and people see competing ballot measures and they vote them all down, all of that happens. Now, the fourth kind of democracy, which I label deliberative democracy by the people themselves, seems almost quaint, seems naive. There are so many limitations on the conditions of the mass public. I sketched three. I'm just going to zip through a lot of my slides and actually just speak because I don't have that much time. Ordinary citizens suffer from what Anthony Downs called rational ignorance. If I have one vote in millions, why should I pay attention to the details of complicated political or policy proposals? I've got other things to do where I can more efficiently achieve what needs to be done. My vote barely counts. It counts infinitesimally. So it's rational, unfortunately, for me to be ignorant. That leads me to be much more open to manipulation and just an impression of sound bites and headlines. And then there's the growth of the persuasion industry that attempts to produce the kind of synthetic public opinion that Schumpeter wanted. That's people under ordinary circumstances. However, lost in the dust of history, there was a solution. And I thought I invented this solution that I'm going to present to you, but I didn't. It's actually obvious in ancient Athens. It's a part of the Athenian practice that Teresa did not talk about. I personally think it's the most distinctive thing in ancient Athens. Let me see. Well, my question here was, who in these other forms of democracy, which are usually in combination, has an incentive to deliberate? Well, I was going to talk about Brexit, but let me jump ahead. By the way, polling sometimes turns up opinions that don't exist because people never want to say they don't know. These are the famous non-attitudes of Philip Converse. And a lot of things are top-of-the-head opinions, not they may have an opinion but just an impression. So when studies of the Public Affairs Act of 1975, the public answered them, but there was no Public Affairs Act of 1975. It was fictional. Then Richard Morin at the Washington Post celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Public Affairs Act of 1975 by asking people about the repeal. And half the sample was told that then President Clinton wanted to repeal it, and half that the Republicans in Congress wanted to repeal it. And they got completely different answers, but it didn't exist, so it couldn't be repealed. And of course, since that time, we've got the further problem that we talk to the like-minded even more in technology, so we never hear the other side, either online or in our choice of media sources or whatever. So these are the problems with public opinion. So I've got a simple solution, which I will describe. I call it deliberative polling, and you can find all about it. I was told I can't promote my book because, but I can gesture towards it. It's called Democracy When the People Are Thinking, and it's not a political fantasy. We have done what I'm about to tell you about in 108 times in 28 countries, and increasingly, originally it was for making television programs. Increasingly, it's for making decisions. So I hope to get, these are some of the countries. First case was in Britain. And let me just say, I don't have time to play the video, but I just want to say about that. So in 1994, we gathered a really good national sample of the British people to a television studio in Manchester. and it was about the issue of crime and what to do about it. Actually, Tony Blair was the first politician to come to it. What we did is we had an advisory group, an agenda of specific things that could be done about crime, and small group discussions, moderated small group discussions, 300 participants who were quite representative of the British public from a larger sample, and questions to competing experts and then to competing politicians. Then they take the same survey as before. Many changes of opinion. But what I wanted to mention about this was that a woman came up to me when this was the very first occasion when we applied this, now 108 times around the world, and she said she wanted to thank me. She was the spouse of a participant, and she came along, but she couldn't participate, she could only observe. She wanted to thank me because she said that in 30 years of marriage, her husband had never read a newspaper. But from the moment he was invited to come to this event, he started to read every newspaper, she said, every day, and he was going to be much more interesting to live with in retirement. Now, for me, that showed me in a flash that we had created a mechanism that overcame the incentives for rational ignorance. That is, if he was one vote in millions, why should he pay attention? But if he was one vote in a small group of 15 and one vote in a sample of 300, and his voice mattered, and this was going to be televised, and this was important, he spent a lot of time preparing. The other thing that happened that weekend is, on the issue of crime, I didn't think about it, but if you have a very good sample of the British people, you'll have criminals in the sample. And so there was this, found myself watching a small group, and this guy was slowly admitting that he was a car thief. And he was explaining what car thieves think about when they're committing crimes, and they don't think about going to prison. And while everything he said was very reasonable and confirmed by the experts later, he added that a random sample of the people has many intellectual resources which can be brought to the dialogue. Now, this is a photo that I took in the Museum of the Forum in Athens. It is the Claritarian machine, what's left of it. And the ancient Athenians selected random samples of 500 or more for the membership in the Council of 500, which set the agenda for the assembly. And if someone made an illegal proposal in the assembly, their speech was subject to the graphe paranomen. They could be prosecuted for making an irresponsible proposal, which was interpreted rather loosely. And after they lost their democracy, because of the Peloponnesian War, which they were goaded into by the orators, they set up another mechanism, legislative commissions after the assembly. So if something passed the assembly, it was only a proposal, and then there was a legal case for and against it, and then they convened another sample of 500 who would deliberate about whether it would pass or not. That was called the nomothetai. So we restored this to Athens in 2006. That's George Papandreou there, who was prime minister for a while. And we were, the financial crisis overwhelmed all of our plans, but we used it to actually select candidates. European Union, you don't need a larger sample for a larger population, so we now understand statistics. So this was scaled to the entire European Union with 27 countries, 22 languages. Well, 21 languages, the Irish all spoke English. We've been using it in China for local decision-making. We even used it with presidential candidates, and my key, but no punchline. I wanted to evaluate the presidential candidates at the beginning before Iowa and New Hampshire. Instead, we just did the issues in 1996, and I'm now hoping to do the candidates. I know I'm running out of time. In Japan, we used it for the privatization of the pension system, and the people didn't want the privatization. It sank from 70% to 29%, and the government canceled the privatization. South Korea just used it to decide whether or not to continue building 2 nuclear reactors, which were mostly built. And the government leans anti-nuclear, the new government. And they announced that the people would decide whether or not to continue building it, and the public decided that they needed the power. And so there was a big movement, and the government accepted this, even though their predilections are anti-nuclear. This was just a few weeks ago. Bulgaria, we used it on the question of whether the Roma children who had their separate segregated schools could be integrated with everybody else. And you see there was a big movement in favor of closing down the Roma-only schools and integrating. The prime minister lauded that, the government accepted that, and eventually now we're told by our Bulgarian partners that we played an important role in the integration of the schools in Bulgaria. It can be used on very hot topics. Northern Ireland, between Protestants and Catholics. In Texas, we used it on the issue of energy choices, and it made a series of decisions which were incorporated by the Public Utility Commission, which led Texas. At the start, Texas was last among the 50 states in the amount of wind power. Now it's number 1. It surpassed California in 2007 because the percentage of the people who are willing to pay more on their electricity bill to support renewable energy went up dramatically. And this was in 8 areas of Texas. Now, Mongolia has now passed a law requiring deliberative polling before the parliament can consider a constitutional amendment. You may not know this, but Mongolia is a competitive democracy. It has been since 1992. It has a private property market system. It has, the mayor of Ulaanbaatar came to see me, and he said, we have highly polarized parties. We have a tabloid media. We have disinformation spread on social media. We have accusations of corruption on all sides. Have you ever heard of a political system like this? So I said yes. So I started going to Mongolia, and we did a very successful project, and eventually now we got passage of this law. And now that's the government palace in Mongolia. That is the statue of Genghis Khan there. That's our scientific sample of about 700 people recruited by the National Statistical Office from all over the country. We also had a separate sample of 700 for comparison purposes. Only 2 people refused to take the initial interview. And I think only about 20 people declined to make the 3-day journey. Mongolia is very large, you know. It's the same size as Western Europe. The journey to Ulaanbaatar for 3 days of deliberation. And what was very interesting was there are 2 main parties who were at loggerheads. And one party had a constitutional amendment that they wanted to indirectly elect the president rather than directly. The other party had a constitutional amendment that they wanted a second chamber of parliament, but it was a specific design for that second chamber. Both parties supported proposals that would fight corruption, have an independent civil service, and an independent judiciary. Some of the proposals for that, by the way, were a little bit quaint. I couldn't understand them at first. One of them was to put the names of the ministries in the Constitution. The reason for that was every time there's an election, the new party comes in, and it swings back and forth wildly, and they change the name of the ministry, and they fire all the civil servants, because the ministry of X no longer exists. Now it's the ministry of Y. And so if you have the names in the Constitution, they can't change it. So this was very popular. And so now, the results of all this have come out, and the parliament is meeting right now, and I'm told, hopefully, cross my fingers, that the amendment, both of the amendments that were supported by each of the parties that went way down are out, and the amendments about the integrity of the civil service, the independent judiciary, the fighting corruption, I think that amendment, constructed the way it's been constructed, will pass. And this will then be the first time since ancient Athens that there has been this kind of major change, constitutional change, brought about by a deliberating random sample. Now, what can this do in America? We've got local projects in the works. I'm hoping we may do another national project in the presidential race. Who knows? It depends on the fundraising, and I'm working with the same producer who did the other one years ago for PBS. But also, the really salutary effects of citizen deliberation come from moderated, diverse discussion in small groups. And that can be spread. Bruce Ackerman and I had a plan, we called it Deliberation Day, but that can be spread online. And we're now working intensively to use social media to create these moderated, diverse discussions and have a national discussion, not just a cosmic discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah, stay up, yeah.
Well, you'll see immediately why deliberative polling is trademarked. So Jim's an excellent salesman for his ideas. And we'll start with a question in the back.
Rich Schifrin. Seems like you're a bit hesitant in your proposals. Should we replace Congress and the executive with random samples of 500 citizens?
My proposal is not to replace, you notice I said democracies are a combination of these different institutions. My proposal is not to replace the other institutions, but to have entry points, as you will see described in my book, various entry points where the citizen deliberation can be consequential and will be made important enough that they can't ignore it, or they can use it, or they can find that it legitimates a hard choice, which is very often, as in the Korean case and the Japanese case, where we found perfectly good incentives for the political actors to then share responsibility for a hard choice with the people after they've thought about it. So there are other values served by the other institutions. There's participation at a mass level, there's political equality, but I think the missing ingredient is deliberation by the people themselves. So I want to add, not take away everything else.
Let me just remark that pretty much everything that people say about public perception of Congress and the executive these days is that they'd prefer to replace Congress and the executive with random samples of 500.
I've seen some polling exactly like that, yes. But I don't need to go that far.
Hi, Howard Gardner from Cambridge. I'm not a cultural anthropologist, but you have an incredible study because you're working in very disparate kinds of countries and societies. What differences occur in the way people construe the tasks that you've given them? I assume there's some similarities, but it'd be interesting to know what you've learned from these very different kinds of geographical locations and histories.
Well, maybe I'm blind, but every time I go to a new country, people say, oh, it won't work here. In Japan, I was told it was too hierarchical and everybody would defer to the older. No, the discussion once it got going was excellent. In Africa, we've done 5 projects in sub-Saharan Africa with largely illiterate populations in areas, and we have adopted the process with video briefings and orally administered questionnaires. And we've done Uganda, Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania, Malawi, and it's worked fantastically there. And we have the transcripts of all the small groups that we can analyze the reasoning. So I was told there the public wouldn't be educated enough. No, it works great there. I think the only issue that I can see on the horizon is if we go to an Arab country where they won't allow women and men in the same discussions, that could be an impediment. But I haven't, but in terms of actual cultural differences, I think that it is all over the world, the public is actually smart. And my colleagues in political science are making a good living by talking about how stupid they are. Look at Aiken and Bartel's Democracy for Realists. The public just doesn't have the capacity. And in fact, they don't have the incentive. You get them in the right conditions, and you tell them that it's something important, and you engage them in a discussion that may be consequential, and they turn out to be quite smart.
Just, you should notice, though, that you sometimes change what you do, and that's an important part.
Of course. You have to adopt a bit, but nevertheless, you have to adopt a bit, but the basic concept is the same.
I think we have a question in the upper deck.
Yes. Bob Ashrafi, Philadelphia. There's some theory of psychology or sociology that underlies this that I'm not getting. What would make the group of 500 or 700 immune to social media, to bribery, to corruption that doesn't happen with Congress or with the president? What makes this, what's the magic here?
Well, first of all, we convene these people for a weekend. Oh, we also have an online version, by the way. We convene these people for a weekend, and we don't release the names so that lobbyists can contact them beforehand. So we have had, in that Greek case, a candidate who wasn't on the agenda tried to stop it by hiring a call center to call up everybody, but of course he couldn't call a random sample, and they were making random calls to all over Athens. So, and then he tried to sabotage it by hanging up a sign saying the event was canceled, but we took that down. So yes, the incentives for competitive, there could be incentives to destroy it, but if you, with proper preparations, you can make these things work. And ordinary citizens, even in Northern Ireland, where I was told it would be impossible, when we got all the Protestants and the Catholics, random sample of the citizens had views that were very similar to the groups that speak for them, but they weren't as entrenched. They were more open to discussion. It was difficult at the beginning to start the discussion, but eventually they opened up to each other. And if we had just had the policy elites that speak for them, they would have been at loggerheads and they would never have budged. But the public is much more open to reason than the people who often represent them.
Jim, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.